Sometimes the person everyone else has given up on is exactly who needs someone to believe in them. In a world that judges too quickly and forgives too slowly, true love often blooms in the most unexpected places. In 1870s Colorado, the town of Cedar Ridge had written off Sarah McKenna as nothing but trouble. Cast out and unwanted, she seemed destined for a hard life alone. But when mountain man Jacob Stone took her in, he saw something the others missed. While they saw her troubled past, he saw her strength and courage. What started as simple kindness grew into something deeper in those mountain peaks. Two broken souls found healing together in the wilderness. But what secret would threaten everything they built? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn morning mist clung to the wooden storefronts of Cedar Ridge like a shroud, and Sarah McKenna pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders as she walked the familiar path to Thompson's General Store. The cobbled main street, rutted from countless wagon wheels and horse hooves, stretched before her like a gauntlet she had to run each day just to survive. At 28, Sarah carried herself with a dignity that poverty and judgment had not been able to break, though both had certainly tried. Her auburn hair, once carefully pinned and styled, now hung in a simple braid down her back. Her dress, a faded blue calico that had seen better years, was clean and mended with careful stitches. On her left hand, catching the pale morning light, sat a simple gold wedding band, the only reminder of Thomas McKenna, her husband of 3 short years, who had died in a mining accident 2 summers past. The townspeople of Cedar Ridge had their opinions about Sarah McKenna, and they weren't shy about sharing them. She was the widow who couldn't seem to find her place, the woman who had somehow failed to secure another husband despite her youth. In a frontier town where women were scarce and marriages were often practical arrangements, Sarah's continued single status was viewed as a character flaw rather than a personal choice. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the banker's wife and self-appointed moral authority of Cedar Ridge, had made it her mission to remind everyone that a woman alone was either a burden or a threat. "Mark my words," she would say, adjusting her spectacles with the authority of someone who had never known want. "A woman like that will bring nothing but trouble to decent folks." The truth was more complex than the gossips cared to understand. Sarah had received proposals, 3 of them in fact. The first from Walter Grimsby, whose hands wandered as freely as his eyes when he thought no one was looking. The second from old Henrik Olsen, who wanted a nurse more than a wife and made no secret of it. The third from Mayor Caldwell's son, Robert, who had kindly explained that he would need her to understand her place and never speak of her late husband. Again, Sarah had declined them all with the same quiet dignity she brought to everything else in her life. She would not trade her self-respect for security, no matter how precarious her situation became. This principled stance, however admirable, had not endeared her to a community that valued conformity above almost everything else. The bell above Thompson's door chimed as she entered, and conversations fell silent with the practiced ease of people who had been talking about the very person who just walked in. Sarah kept her chin up and her expression neutral as she approached the counter, where James Thompson sorted through a delivery of supplies. "Morning, Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice carrying the refined cadence that marked her as different from most frontier women. Sarah had been raised in Denver, educated in a proper school, and married to a man who had encouraged her to read and think for herself. These qualities, which should have been assets, had instead become sources of suspicion in Cedar Ridge. Thompson looked up, his weathered face creasing into what passed for a smile. He was one of the few people in town who treated Sarah with basic decency, though she suspected this had more to do with her reliable payments than any personal sympathy. "Mrs. McKenna, what can I do for you today?" "I need coffee, flour, and salt if you have them. And perhaps some of that honey you had last week, if there's any left." Thompson nodded and began gathering her items. Behind her, Sarah could hear the whispered conversations resuming, fragments about that McKenna woman and causing problems that she had grown skilled at ignoring. As Thompson wrapped her purchases, the store door opened with enough force to make the bell ring frantically. Sarah turned to see Mayor Caldwell enter, flanked by two members of the town council, Dr. Harrison and Reverend Walsh. The expression on Caldwell's face suggested this was not a casual shopping trip. "Mrs. McKenna," Caldwell said, his voice carrying the authority of his office. "Oh, we've been looking for you." Sarah's hands stilled on her packages. "Is there something I can help you with, Mayor?" "I think you know why we're here." Caldwell's grey eyes were cold, and Sarah felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. "There have been complaints." "What kind of complaints?" Dr. Harrison stepped forward, his medical bag clutched in his hand like a shield. "About your living situation? About the influence you might be having on the younger women in town? About your refusal to accept the generous offers you've received?" Sarah's jaw tightened. "My living situation is hardly anyone's concern but my own. I pay my rent, I cause no trouble, and I certainly haven't influenced anyone to do anything improper." "That's not how everyone sees it," Reverend Walsh interjected, his thin voice carrying the weight of moral authority. "A woman alone, refusing the stability of marriage, setting an example of defiance." Defiance? Sarah's composure cracked slightly. "Is it defiance to choose not to marry men who view me as property or a convenience?" The silence that followed was heavy with disapproval. Around the store, other customers had stopped their shopping to listen, creating an audience for what was clearly meant to be Sarah's public censure. Mayor Caldwell cleared his throat. "The fact remains, Mrs. McKenna, that your presence in Cedar Ridge has become problematic. The town council has discussed this matter at length, and we've reached a decision." Sarah's heart began to race, but she kept her voice steady. "What decision?" "You have 1 week to make arrangements to leave Cedar Ridge. We'll provide a wagon and supplies for travel, but your residency here is no longer welcome." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Cedar Ridge wasn't much, but it was the only home she had left. Her husband was buried in the cemetery on the hill overlooking the town. Her small rented room above the seamstress shop contained the few possessions that remained of her old life. "This is my home," she said quietly. "I've done nothing wrong." "You've done nothing right either." Mrs. Hartwell's voice cut through the store as she emerged from behind a display of fabric. A proper woman would have accepted one of those proposals and settled down. Instead, you parade around like you're too good for the rest of us. Sarah turned to face the other woman, her auburn hair catching the light from the store's windows. "I've never acted as if I were better than anyone. I've simply asked to be treated with the same respect I show others." "Respect is earned," Dr. Harrison said, adjusting his spectacles, "and earned through proper behavior, through understanding one's place in the community." The injustice of it all crashed over Sarah like a wave. She had nursed sick children when the doctor was unavailable. She had sewn burial shrouds for families who couldn't afford them. She had shared her meager supplies with neighbors in need. Yet because she wouldn't marry for convenience, she was being driven from her home. 1 week, Mayor Caldwell repeated. "We're not unreasonable people, Mrs. McKenna. We're offering you a chance to leave with dignity." Sarah's fingers found her wedding ring, turning it slowly as she often did when thinking of Thomas. He would have been furious at this treatment, would have stood up to these people with the quiet strength that had made her fall in love with him. But Thomas was gone, and Sarah was alone. "I understand," she said finally, though her voice carried a tremor she couldn't quite suppress. As the town officials filed out of the store, Sarah completed her purchases with hands that shook slightly. The other customers avoided her eyes, suddenly fascinated by displays they had seen hundreds of times before. The silence stretched uncomfortably until the door closed behind the last customer, leaving Sarah alone with Thompson. "I'm sorry about that, Mrs. McKenna," the shopkeeper said quietly. "It ain't right what they're doing." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. She gathered her packages and walked toward the door, her dignity intact even as her world crumbled around her. Outside, the autumn air seemed sharper, the mountains in the distance more imposing. Cedar Ridge suddenly felt smaller, its wooden buildings and dusty streets closing in around her like a trap. She had 1 week to figure out where a woman with no family and limited means could go in a territory where winter was approaching fast. As she walked back toward her small room, Sarah passed the cemetery where Thomas lay buried beneath a simple wooden cross. She paused at the gate, looking up at the hill where weathered headstones marked the lives of people who had found their final rest in Cedar Ridge. Soon, she would have to leave even this connection to her past behind. But Sarah McKenna had survived her husband's death, poverty, and 2 years of social isolation. She would find a way to survive this too. She had to believe that somewhere in this vast territory there was a place where a woman could be valued for her character rather than her willingness to compromise. What she could not have imagined was that her salvation would come from the most unlikely source of all, a man the townspeople whispered about but rarely saw, who lived alone in the mountains and was known throughout the territory simply as Jacob Stone. The mountain man who would change everything was, at that very moment, loading supplies onto his packhorse just 3 streets away, preparing for his monthly trip back to the high country where the first snows were already beginning to fall. 3 days had passed since the town council's ultimatum, and Sarah McKenna sat on the edge of her narrow bed, staring at the worn leather traveling bag that held everything she owned in the world. The bag had belonged to her mother, had carried her possessions when she first came west with Thomas, and now would carry them away from the only home she had left. She had spent those 3 days making inquiries, writing letters to distant relatives who might remember her, and exploring every possible option for a woman alone on the frontier. The responses had been discouraging at best. Her aunt in Kansas City had written back suggesting Sarah consider a position as a governess, but required references from respectable families, something the people of Cedar Ridge were unlikely to provide. A cousin in San Francisco had offered sympathy, but cited her own family's financial struggles as reason she couldn't help. Sarah folded her few dresses carefully, along with her mother's recipe book and the small photograph of her and Thomas on their wedding day. Her fingers lingered on the image, Thomas in his best suit, herself in the white dress she had sewn with such hope for the future. How different things might have been if that mineshaft hadn't collapsed. A sharp knock at her door interrupted her packing. Sarah rose and opened it to find Mrs. Patterson, the seamstress who rented her the room, standing in the hallway with an expression of barely concealed excitement. "There's someone downstairs asking for you," Mrs. Patterson said, her eyes bright with curiosity. "A mountain man." Big fellow, doesn't say much. Sarah's heart skipped. Mountain men rarely came into town, and when they did, it was usually for supplies before disappearing back into the wilderness. She couldn't imagine why one would be asking for her specifically. Did he give a name? Stone, Jacob Stone. Mrs. Patterson leaned closer, lowering her voice. "He's the one they tell stories about. Lives way up in the high country, comes down maybe once a month. Folks say he was a soldier once, but nobody knows for sure." Sarah had heard the name whispered in the general store and saloons. Jacob Stone was something of a local legend, a man who had chosen complete solitude over the company of others, who could survive in conditions that would kill most men, and who was said to be fair in his dealings but dangerous to cross. "What does he want with me?" "Didn't say. Just asked if Sarah McKenna lived here and if he could speak with her." Mrs. Patterson's expression grew more serious. "I told him about your situation." "Hope that was all right," Sarah nodded, though her stomach churned with nervousness. She smoothed her skirt and checked her hair in the small mirror before following Mrs. Patterson downstairs to the shop's main room. Jacob Stone stood near the window, his broad frame silhouetted against the afternoon light. He was taller than Sarah had expected, well over 6 feet, with dark hair that brushed his collar and a beard that spoke of long months in the wilderness. His clothes were practical, worn leather pants, a heavy wool shirt, and boots that had seen countless miles of mountain trails. At his side hung a hunting knife in a well-worn sheath, and his hands, Sarah noticed, were scarred from years of hard work. When he turned to face her, Sarah was struck by his eyes, a deep brown that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. There was no judgment in his gaze, no assumption or expectation. He simply looked at her as if she were a person worthy of his attention, something that had become rare in Cedar Ridge. "Mrs. McKenna," he said, his voice deep and quiet. "I'm Jacob Stone, Mr. Stone." Sarah inclined her head politely. "Mrs. Patterson said you wanted to speak with me." He nodded toward the door. "Would you mind walking with me? What I have to say might be better discussed privately." Sarah hesitated for a moment, then reached for her shawl. Whatever this man wanted, it couldn't be worse than her current situation. She followed him outside into the crisp afternoon air. Jacob Stone didn't speak immediately. Instead, he walked slowly down the main street, his long strides adjusted to match her pace. Sarah noticed how people stared from doorways and windows, some with curiosity, others with the kind of wariness reserved for things they didn't understand. "I heard about the town council's decision," he said finally, his voice carrying just loud enough for her to hear. "Seems like a hard thing to do to a woman who's caused no real trouble." Sarah glanced up at him, surprised by the directness of his statement. "News travels quickly in a small town." It does. They had reached the edge of town, where the road began its climb toward the mountains. Jacob stopped and turned to face her. "I also heard you've got no place to go." The bluntness of it stung, but Sarah appreciated his honesty more than the polite sympathy others had offered. "That's true. I've got a cabin up in the high country, about a day's ride from here, in a valley most folks don't know exists. It's not fancy, but it's solid and warm. And there's good water and game." Sarah stared at him, not immediately understanding what he was suggesting. "I'm offering you a place to stay," Jacob continued, his brown eyes steady on hers. "For as long as you need it. No strings attached. No expectations, except that you pull your own weight." The offer was so unexpected that Sarah couldn't respond immediately. A dozen questions flooded her mind, along with the warnings she had heard about trusting strange men in the wilderness. But when she looked at Jacob Stone, she didn't see the predatory gleam she had learned to recognize in men like Walter Grimsby. She saw something else entirely, a quiet strength and an honesty that seemed as solid as the mountains themselves. "Why?" she asked finally. "You don't even know me." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving to the mountains that rose beyond the town. "I know enough. I know you've been treated poorly by people who should have known better. And I know what it's like to be judged for choices that make sense to you, but not to others. But a woman alone with a man, people will talk." A slight smile touched the corner of his mouth. "People already talk about both of us, Mrs. McKenna. Can't imagine it getting much worse." Sarah found herself almost smiling in return. There was a dry humor in his words that appealed to her, and a logic that was hard to argue with. What did the opinions of Cedar Ridge matter if she was being forced to leave anyway? "Your cabin? Is it really as isolated as you say?" "More so. Nearest neighbor is about 20 miles away, and he's another fellow who prefers his own company. You'd have privacy and peace and time to figure out what you want to do next." The promise of peace was almost overwhelming. Sarah had lived with the weight of constant judgment for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to simply exist without defending her choices. "What would you expect from me in return?" "Like I said, just that you pull your weight. Help with the cooking and mending, maybe tend a garden come spring. Basic things that make life easier for both of us." Sarah studied his face, looking for any sign of deception or hidden motives. She found none. Jacob Stone seemed to be exactly what he appeared, a man offering help to someone who needed it, with no ulterior purpose beyond basic human decency. "The winter's coming," he continued. "Mountain winter's hard and it lasts long. If you're going to consider this, it needs to be soon." Sarah thought of her half-packed bag upstairs, of the letters she had written to relatives who couldn't or wouldn't help, of the 4 days remaining before the town council expected her to be gone. Then she thought of the mountains she could see from her window, wild and free and untouched by the petty judgments of small-minded people. I need some time to think about it, she said. Of course. Jacob reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. I'll be camping by Miller's Creek tonight, about 2 miles north of town. If you decide you want to come, meet me there at first light. If not, I'll head back up to the high country and you'll not be bothered by me again. Sarah took the paper, which contained simple directions to the creek. Their fingers brushed briefly as she took it, and she was surprised by the gentleness of his touch. Thank you, she said. For the offer, I mean. Whatever I decide, it was kind of you to make it. Jacob nodded and tipped his hat. Until tomorrow, then. Or not. Sarah watched him walk away, his long strides carrying him quickly toward the edge of town. As he disappeared around a bend in the road, she realized she was holding her breath. She looked down at the paper in her hand, then up at the mountains, where snow was already beginning to dust the highest peaks. For the first time in days, she had a choice that didn't involve compromise or surrender. Whatever Jacob Stone's motivations, he was offering her something no one else had the chance to start over on her own terms. Now she just had to decide if she was brave enough to take it. Sarah stood before the hand-carved door of Jacob Stone's mountain cabin, her traveling bag clutched in one hand and her heart hammering against her ribs. The decision to meet him at Miller's Creek that morning had been made in the pre-dawn darkness of her rented room, when the alternative, boarding a wagon to nowhere with the few dollars she had saved, seemed far more frightening than trusting a stranger. The journey to the cabin had taken most of the day, winding through trails that seemed to disappear and reappear at Jacob's whim. He had ridden ahead on his horse while she followed on the gentle mare he had provided, speaking little but occasionally pointing out landmarks or warning her about loose rocks on the narrow path. Now, as evening shadows stretched across the mountain valley, Sarah found herself facing a life completely unlike anything she had known. The cabin was larger than she had expected, built from massive logs that spoke of both skill and permanence. Jacob had carved the door himself, she realized, noting the intricate details worked into the wood, pine boughs and mountain peaks that seemed to flow naturally from the grain. It's beautiful, she said. Running her fingers along the carved surface, Jacob paused in unloading supplies from his pack horse. Took me most of a winter to get it right. Had plenty of time to work on it. He opened the door and gestured for her to enter first. The interior was spartanly furnished, but immaculately clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a simple wooden table and 2 chairs positioned nearby. Along another wall stood a cooking area with shelves holding neatly arranged supplies. A ladder led to a small loft area that Sarah assumed was Jacob's sleeping quarters. You can have the main room, Jacob said, as if reading her thoughts. I'll move my things upstairs. There's a curtain we can string up for privacy if you want. Sarah set down her bag and looked around the space that would be her home for the indefinite future. It was rustic, certainly, but there was something peaceful about its simplicity. No ornate furniture that required constant care, no delicate items that might break and cause social catastrophe. Just solid, practical comfort. This is more than generous, Mr. Stone. I don't know how to thank you. Jacob, he said, beginning to move items from a trunk near the fireplace. And you can thank me by making yourself useful. First rule of mountain living, everyone contributes or everyone suffers. Over the next hour, Jacob showed her the basics of life in his remote valley. The well was 50 yards from the cabin, protected by a small wooden shelter he had built to keep animals away from the water source. The root cellar, dug into the hillside behind the cabin, stored vegetables and preserved meat that would see them through the winter months. A small barn housed his horse and the mule he used for heavy work, along with tools for maintaining the property. Nearest town besides Cedar Ridge is Millfield, about 30 miles north, Jacob explained, as they walked the perimeter of his cleared land. I go there sometimes for supplies I can't make or grow myself. Folks there don't ask many questions. Sarah nodded, beginning to understand the isolation she had committed herself to. They were truly alone here, dependent on each other and their own resources for survival. The thought should have terrified her, but instead she felt a surprising sense of relief. No Mrs. Hartwell to scrutinize her every movement. No town council to judge her choices. Just the mountains, the changing seasons, and the simple requirements of daily survival. "What do you do up here all alone?" she asked as they returned to the cabin. Jacob considered the question as he fed wood to the fireplace. "I hunt, trap some, raise vegetables in the summer, read when the weather's bad. Think mostly. Don't you get lonely?" He looked at her across the growing fire, his brown eyes reflecting the flames. "Loneliness is different from being alone. I was lonelier in towns full of people than I've ever been up here." Sarah understood that distinction more than she cared to admit. She had been surrounded by people in Cedar Ridge, but had felt increasingly isolated as their judgment weighed on her. Here, with only Jacob for company, she felt less alone than she had in months. "What about you?" Jacob asked, settling into one of the chairs by the fire. "What did you do before your husband died?" Sarah took the other chair, grateful for his direct approach to what could have been an awkward topic. "Thomas and I had a small house in Cedar Ridge. I kept house, helped some of the other women with sewing and cooking when they needed it. Thomas worked the copper mine until—" She paused, the familiar tightness in her throat making it difficult to continue. "Mine accident," Jacob said quietly. It wasn't a question. Cave in. He and 3 other men didn't make it out. Sarah stared into the fire, remembering the awful day when Dr. Harrison had come to her door with his hat in his hands and sorrow in his eyes. "That was 2 years ago. I'm sorry for your loss." The simple words, spoken without elaboration or false comfort, meant more to Sarah than all the lengthy condolences she had received from the people of Cedar Ridge. Jacob didn't tell her it was God's will or that Thomas was in a better place. He simply acknowledged her loss and let her grief exist without trying to diminish it. "Thank you," she said. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire consume the seasoned wood Jacob had cut and split sometime during the endless months of his solitary existence. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees with a sound like whispered conversations, and somewhere in the distance a wolf howled, long and mournful, and utterly wild. "Are there many wolves up here?" Sarah asked. "Some. They don't usually bother people if you don't bother them. Same with the bears mostly, though they're more unpredictable." Jacob stood and moved to the cooking area. "I should warn you, life up here isn't easy, especially for someone used to town conveniences. Water has to be hauled from the well. Food has to be prepared from basic ingredients. Firewood doesn't split itself, and if we don't keep enough cut and stacked, we'll freeze when the real cold comes." Sarah rose and joined him near the simple wooden counter where he was preparing their evening meal. "I'm not afraid of hard work, Jacob. I may have lived in town, but I wasn't raised to be helpless." He glanced at her, taking in her determined expression and the set of her shoulders. "I believe that. But this is different from anything you've known. The mountains don't forgive mistakes, and winter up here can kill you if you're not prepared." "Then teach me," Sarah said simply. "Show me what I need to know to survive here." Jacob nodded slowly, and Sarah thought she detected a hint of approval in his expression. "We'll start tomorrow. First lesson is chopping wood. You'll need to build calluses before the real work begins." As they prepared and shared their simple meal of beans, cornbread and coffee, Sarah found herself studying her unexpected host. Jacob Stone was unlike any man she had known. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone completely comfortable in his environment, wasted no motion or words, and seemed to possess an inner stillness that spoke of hard-won peace. When the meal was finished and the dishes cleaned, Jacob strung a rope across one corner of the main room and hung a heavy blanket to create a private sleeping area for Sarah. The gesture was practical, but also respectful, acknowledging her need for privacy without making a fuss about it. "Good night, Sarah," he said as he climbed the ladder to the loft. "Good night." Jacob, alone behind her makeshift curtain, Sarah unpacked her few belongings and prepared for her first night in the mountains. As she settled onto the simple but comfortable bed Jacob had provided, she listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness, the settling of the cabin walls, the distant call of a night bird, the whisper of wind through the trees. For the first time in 2 years, Sarah McKenna fell asleep without worrying about what tomorrow's judgments might bring. Sarah's hands were raw and blistered by the end of her first week at the cabin, but she had never felt more capable. Each morning, Jacob would assign her tasks that seemed impossible: splitting kindling, hauling water, learning to preserve meat from his hunting trips, and each evening, she would collapse into bed, having accomplished things she had never imagined herself doing. On this particular morning, she stood in the cabin's main room, consulting her mother's recipe book, while Jacob worked outside mending harnesses. The small, weathered notebook had traveled with her from Colorado Springs to Cedar Ridge, and now to this remote mountain valley. Its pages held more than recipes. They contained her mother's careful handwriting, notes about family gatherings, and memories of a time when cooking was about creating joy rather than merely surviving. "Sarah?" Jacob's voice called from outside. "Could you come here a moment?" She set down the book and stepped outside to find Jacob examining the cabin's chimney with a frown. A light snow had begun to fall, dusting the clearing with the season's first real accumulation. "What's wrong?" "Mortar's cracking around some of these stones. If I don't fix it before the hard cold sets in, we'll have smoke backing up into the cabin." He gestured toward the damaged area. "I need to mix new mortar, but it's easier with 2 people. You mind helping?" Sarah nodded, though she had no idea what mixing mortar involved. Over the past week, she had learned that "I don't know how" was rarely an acceptable answer in mountain life. Jacob had patiently taught her to distinguish between different types of firewood, to read weather signs in the movement of clouds, and to preserve vegetables in the root cellar, using techniques that seemed like magic. For the next 2 hours, they worked together preparing clay and limestone mortar in a wooden trough behind the cabin. Jacob showed her how to achieve the right consistency, testing the mixture by letting it hold its shape when pressed. Sarah found herself watching his hands as he demonstrated, scarred and calloused from years of this life, but surprisingly gentle when handling delicate tasks. "You're a good student," Jacob said, as Sarah successfully mixed a batch to his specifications. "Most people from town would have given up by now. Most people from town never had to learn or starve," Sarah replied. Wiping sweat from her forehead despite the cool air, Jacob paused in his work, studying her with those perceptive brown eyes. "Is that how it felt? Like you might starve?" Sarah considered the question as she continued mixing. "Not physically, maybe. But yes, in other ways. I felt like I was slowly disappearing, becoming less and less myself every day. I tried to fit into what they expected. And now?" She looked around the clearing, taking in the mountains that surrounded them, the cabin that was becoming home, and the man who had given her a chance to start over. "Now I feel like I'm becoming more myself than I've been in years." Jacob nodded and returned to his work. But Sarah caught what might have been a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. That afternoon, while Jacob climbed onto the roof to repair the chimney, Sarah decided to surprise him with something special for dinner. She had been contributing to their meals all week, but tonight she wanted to create something that would remind them both that they were building more than just survival. They were creating a home. She consulted her mother's recipe book, finding the instructions for beef stew that had been a family favorite. Jacob had brought back venison from a hunting trip 2 days earlier, and Sarah had been carefully rationing their vegetables to make them last through winter. Tonight seemed like the right time to use some of their stores for something more elaborate than their usual simple fare. As she worked, Sarah found herself humming, something she realized she hadn't done since Thomas died. The melody was an old hymn her mother used to sing while cooking, and it seemed to fill the cabin with warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. "Something smells good in here." Sarah turned to find Jacob standing in the doorway, snow dusting his dark hair and shoulders. He had finished the chimney repair and looked tired but satisfied with the work. "I hope you don't mind. I used some of the vegetables you've been saving." Jacob hung his coat on a peg by the door and moved closer to the cooking area. "Mind?" Sarah, that smells better than anything I've eaten in months. She felt a flush of pleasure at his approval. Cooking for Jacob was different from the obligatory meal preparation she had done as a widow, trying to stretch her small income. This felt like caring for someone who appreciated her efforts, whose approval mattered because it was freely given rather than expected. "It was my mother's recipe," Sarah said, stirring the thick stew. "She always said the secret was in the timing, knowing when to add each ingredient so they all come together properly." "She sounds like a wise woman." She was. Sarah's voice grew soft with memory. "She died when I was 19, just before I married Thomas. I always wished she could have met him, could have seen how happy we were." Jacob settled into his chair by the fire, but his attention remained on Sarah as she moved around the cooking area with growing confidence. "Tell me about him." "About Thomas." Sarah paused in her stirring, surprised by the request. Most people in Cedar Ridge had grown uncomfortable when she mentioned her late husband, as if her continuing love for him was somehow inappropriate. "He was kind," she said finally, "and patient. He never made me feel foolish for having opinions about things. Never suggested that I should keep my thoughts to myself because I was a woman. Sounds like a good man." He was. Sarah ladled the stew into bowls and brought them to the table. "He used to say that two people should make each other stronger, not smaller." Jacob accepted his bowl with a nod of thanks. "Smart man." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the whisper of snow against the windows. Sarah watched Jacob's face as he tasted her cooking, noting the way his expression softened with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. "This is remarkable," he said finally. "I haven't had a meal like this since I came up to the mountains." "How long has that been?" Jacob paused with his spoon halfway to his mouth. 8 years this spring." Sarah felt a stab of something that might have been sadness. 8 years of eating alone, of preparing simple meals focused only on sustenance, of having no one to cook for or care about. It seemed like a lonely existence. Despite Jacob's apparent contentment with his solitary life. "What brought you up here?" she asked carefully, unsure if the question would be welcome. Jacob finished his mouthful and set down his spoon. For a moment Sarah thought he might not answer. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain, carefully controlled. "I was a soldier for a while. Came back from the war and found I didn't fit in towns anymore. Too many people, too much noise, too many folks who wanted to talk about things I'd rather forget." Sarah nodded, understanding more than Jacob might have expected. She had seen that haunted look in other men who had returned from the war, the way they sometimes seemed to be listening for sounds no one else could hear, watching for threats that existed only in their memories. "Do you ever miss it?" "Town life, I mean?" Jacob considered the question as he returned to his meal. "I miss some things. Good conversation sometimes. The feeling of being part of something larger than yourself." He glanced at Sarah across the table. "But mostly I found peace up here. Found out who I really was when I stripped away everything I thought I was supposed to be." Sarah understood that feeling completely. In this remote mountain valley, she was discovering parts of herself that had been buried under years of trying to meet other people's expectations. She was stronger than she had known, more capable, more resilient. As they finished their meal and cleaned up together, Sarah realized that for the first time since Thomas died, she was genuinely happy. Not content, not merely surviving, but actually happy. The recognition surprised her with its intensity. The brass compass in Jacob's weathered hand caught the morning light as he showed Sarah how to read the mountain landmarks. 3 weeks had passed since her arrival, and the early snows had given way to the serious business of winter preparation. Today, Jacob had decided she needed to learn navigation, not just around their immediate valley, but across the broader mountain territory that surrounded them. True north isn't always the same as magnetic north up here, Jacob explained, adjusting the compass housing to account for the local declination. Iron deposits in the mountains can throw off a compass reading by several degrees. That's why you learn to read the land itself. Sarah studied the instrument with fascination. It was clearly old and well used, the brass case worn smooth from countless hands and journeys. Jacob handled it with the care of someone who understood its value, went far beyond its practical function. "Was this your father's?" she asked, noting the initials ES engraved on the case. Jacob nodded. "Elijah Stone. He was a surveyor for the territorial government, spent most of his life mapping these mountains. This compass guided him through territory that wasn't even on official maps yet, and now it guides you. Has for 8 years. Probably saved my life more than once during my first winters up here." Jacob tucked the compass into his coat pocket with practiced care. "My father always said that knowing your direction was about more than just finding your way. It was about understanding your place in the larger world." Sarah found herself thinking about that concept as they walked the perimeter of Jacob's property. Direction, purpose, understanding one's place. These had been missing from her life for the past 2 years. In Cedar Ridge, she had felt directionless, floating without anchor or destination. Here in the mountains, surrounded by challenges that demanded her full attention and capabilities, she was beginning to find her true north again. "Jacob," she said, as they paused at the edge of the clearing where the forest began its climb toward the higher peaks. "Can I ask you something personal?" He leaned against a tall pine, snowflakes catching in his dark hair. "Depends on what it is. When you came up here after the war, were you running from something or towards something?" Jacob was quiet for a long moment, his brown eyes focused on the mountains that rose beyond their valley. Sarah began to think she had overstepped some boundary, pushed too hard into territory he preferred to keep private. "Both, I suppose," he said finally. "Running from what I'd seen, what I'd done, towards something I couldn't name but hoped I'd recognize when I found it." "Did you find it, I mean?" Jacob looked at her then, really looked at her, and Sarah felt something shift between them, a deepening of the trust and partnership they had been building through weeks of shared work and quiet conversation. "I found peace," he said. "Found out I could live with myself if I lived simply and honestly. Found out that solitude wasn't the same thing as loneliness, like I told you that first night. And now, with me here disrupting your solitude." A smile tugged at the corner of Jacob's mouth. "You're not disrupting anything, Sarah. If anything, you're—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "You're making me remember that there are different kinds of peace. The kind you find alone, and the kind you find with the right person." The words hung in the air between them, carrying weight that neither of them seemed quite ready to examine directly. Sarah felt her cheeks warm despite the cold mountain air, and she looked away toward the snow-covered peaks. "We should head back," Jacob said, his voice returning to its usual practical tone. "I want to show you how to bank the fire properly for when I'm away hunting." As they walked back toward the cabin, Sarah found herself acutely aware of Jacob's presence beside her, the sound of his boots crunching through the snow, the way he automatically shortened his stride to match hers, the occasional brush of his sleeve against her arm when the path narrowed. These small intimacies of shared space had become precious to her in ways she was only beginning to understand. That afternoon, while Jacob worked on repairing a broken harness, Sarah decided to tackle the mending that had been accumulating over the past weeks. She had noticed that several of Jacob's shirts showed the wear of hard mountain life, small tears from thorns and branches, frayed cuffs, buttons that hung by threads. She settled by the fire with her sewing basket, a luxury she had insisted on bringing from Cedar Ridge despite Jacob's warnings about traveling light. As she worked on a particularly stubborn tear in his favorite wool shirt, Sarah found herself thinking about the intimacy of caring for someone's clothing. It was domestic work that spoke of permanence, of planning for a future together, rather than merely surviving from day to day. "You don't have to do that," Jacob said, looking up from his own work to see her carefully matching thread to fabric. "I know," Sarah replied, not looking up from her stitching. "I want to." The simple statement carried more meaning than either of them acknowledged aloud. Sarah wanted to care for Jacob, wanted to contribute to their shared life in ways that went beyond the basic survival tasks he had taught her. She wanted to make their cabin more than just a shelter. She wanted to make it a home. "Sarah," Jacob said quietly, and something in his tone made her look up from her sewing. "Yes, I need you to know something. About why I really offered to bring you up here." Sarah set down her mending, giving him her full attention. Jacob rarely spoke about his motivations or feelings, preferring to let his actions speak for themselves. "It wasn't just charity," he continued, his hands stilling on the leather he was working. "When I heard what those people were doing to you, how they were treating you, it made me angry in a way I hadn't felt in years." "Angry?" "Furious," Jacob corrected. "You were being punished for having principles, for refusing to compromise yourself for their comfort. That kind of small-minded cruelty." He shook his head, his jaw tightening with remembered emotion. Sarah felt something warm unfurl in her chest. Jacob's offer had seemed too generous to be real, too good to be true. To learn that it had come from a place of genuine outrage at her treatment, of respect for her choices rather than pity for her circumstances, changed everything. "Thank you," she said softly, "for telling me that." "There's more," Jacob said, meeting her eyes across the firelit room. "Having you here, it's changed things for me. Made me realize how empty this place was before, how much I was just existing rather than living." Sarah's breath caught. The admission was more than Jacob had ever revealed about his inner life, more vulnerability than she had expected from a man who had built his existence around self-reliance and emotional control. "It's changed things for me too," she said, "in ways I'm still trying to understand." They looked at each other across the quiet cabin, the crackle of the fire and the whisper of wind outside the only sounds. Something had shifted between them. Some barrier had been crossed, and they both seemed to recognize that their relationship was becoming something neither of them had planned for. "Sarah," Jacob said, his voice rough with emotion he was clearly struggling to control. But before he could continue, a sound from outside broke the moment, the distant but unmistakable sound of horses approaching through the snow. Jacob was on his feet instantly, moving to the window with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to potential danger. "Riders coming up the valley," he said, his voice sharp with concern. 3 of them, maybe 4. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. No one should be coming to Jacob's remote cabin, especially not in weather like this. Whatever brought visitors to their peaceful valley, she was certain it wasn't good news. Sarah's fingers found her mother's silver locket at her throat, a nervous habit she had developed during the difficult days in Cedar Ridge. The small piece of jewelry held the only photograph she had of her parents together, and touching it often brought her comfort in moments of uncertainty. Now, as the sound of approaching horses grew closer, the locket felt less like comfort and more like a tangible connection to the family she had lost and the belonging she was still searching for. Jacob moved away from the window with the controlled urgency of a man accustomed to trouble. "Get your coat," he said quietly, "and stay close to me when we go outside. Who do you think it is?" "Don't know yet, but honest folks don't usually ride up here in weather like this, and they sure don't travel in groups." Jacob checked his rifle, though he made no move to load it. Could be lost, could be looking for shelter, could be something else entirely. Sarah pulled on her heavy coat, the one Jacob had insisted she buy from Thompson's store before leaving Cedar Ridge. At the time, she had thought it unnecessarily expensive, but after weeks in the mountains, she understood that good gear could mean the difference between comfort and suffering, sometimes even between life and death. The sound of hoofbeats stopped just outside the cabin, followed by the jingle of harnesses and the low murmur of men's voices. Jacob opened the door before anyone could knock, stepping out onto the covered porch, with Sarah close behind him. 4 men sat their horses in the clearing, all of them looking cold and travel-worn. Sarah recognized 2 of them immediately, Mayor Caldwell and his son Robert, both bundled in heavy coats but clearly unprepared for serious mountain travel. The other 2 were strangers, rough-looking men with the hard eyes of people accustomed to getting their way through intimidation. "Mr. Stone," Mayor Caldwell called out, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "We need to speak with you." "Speak then," Jacob replied, his voice carrying none of the warmth Sarah had grown accustomed to. This was the Jacob Stone that Cedar Ridge whispered about, hard, direct, and slightly dangerous. It's about Mrs. McKenna, Robert Caldwell said, his pale eyes finding Sarah standing behind Jacob. We've come to take her back to town. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. What? Mayor Caldwell dismounted, his movement stiff from the cold ride. There's been a development, Mrs. McKenna. Information has come to light about your situation that changes things considerably. What kind of information? Jacob's voice had taken on an edge that made Sarah suddenly very aware of the hunting knife at his side. The kind that's none of your business, mountain man, one of the strangers said, also dismounting. He was a big man with scarred hands and the confident swagger of someone who relied on physical intimidation. We're here for the woman, not to chat with you. Jacob stepped forward, placing himself more directly between Sarah and the visitors. Anyone who comes onto my land makes it my business. And anyone who wants to take someone from my land better have a damn good reason. We have legal documents, Mayor Caldwell said quickly, clearly sensing the tension building between Jacob and the stranger. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. Mrs. McKenna needs to return to Cedar Ridge immediately to resolve matters concerning her late husband's estate. Sarah's heart began to race. Thomas had left her nothing but debts when he died. The mine company had made that clear when they refused to pay benefits to the families of the men killed in the collapse. There was no estate to resolve, no legal matters that would require her return. That's impossible, she said, stepping out from behind Jacob despite his subtle gesture for her to stay back. Thomas left no estate. The mine company made sure of that. Robert Caldwell smiled, and the expression was cold and calculating. That's where you're wrong, Mrs. McKenna. It seems your husband had investments you weren't aware of. Quite substantial ones, as it turns out. Sarah stared at him in confusion. Thomas had been many things, kind, intelligent, hard-working, but he had never been secretive about money. They had shared everything, discussed every expenditure, planned together for their modest future. The idea that he had hidden substantial investments was impossible. You're lying, she said simply. The documents don't lie, the big stranger said, his hand resting meaningfully on the gun at his hip. And they say you need to come back to town to claim what's rightfully yours. Jacob moved slightly, a shift in stance that put him in a better position to react if the situation turned violent. Sarah could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a forge. Let me see those documents, Jacob said. These are legal matters that don't concern you, Mayor Caldwell replied, though his voice carried less authority than it had in Cedar Ridge's general store. Everything that happens on my land concerns me, Jacob said flatly. Show me the papers or get back on your horses and ride out. For a moment, Sarah thought the strangers might choose violence over compliance. The bigger man's hand tightened on his gun, and his companion shifted in his saddle as if preparing to dismount. But something in Jacob's stillness, in the complete absence of fear or uncertainty in his bearing, seemed to give them pause. Mayor Caldwell handed over the documents with obvious reluctance. Jacob scanned them quickly, his expression growing darker with each line he read. These papers are forgeries, he said finally, looking up at the mounted men. Poor ones at that. The territorial seal is wrong, and the judge's signature is a clumsy copy. You're hardly qualified to judge legal documents, Robert Caldwell said. But his voice lacked conviction. I'm qualified to recognize lies, Jacob replied. And to know when someone's trying to con a woman who doesn't deserve it. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. What's really going on here? Why are you trying to get me back to Cedar Ridge? The big stranger laughed, a harsh sound in the quiet valley. Tell her, Caldwell. Tell her about her inheritance. Mayor Caldwell's face flushed red above his coat collar. There are parties interested in arranging a suitable marriage for Mrs. McKenna, parties who are willing to pay handsomely for the privilege. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. They weren't here because of any inheritance or legal matter. They were here to sell her to the highest bidder, to drag her back to Cedar Ridge and force her into a marriage with whoever had paid them enough to make the deception worthwhile. You bastards, Jacob said quietly, his voice carrying more menace than any shout could have conveyed. Business is business, the stranger replied with a shrug. Woman like her, young and healthy, there's men willing to pay good money for that, especially when she comes with a reputation for being hard to get. Sarah felt sick. They were talking about her like she was livestock to be bought and sold, reducing her to nothing more than a commodity in some twisted transaction. Get off my land, Jacob said, his hand moving to his knife. Now. We're not leaving without the woman, the big stranger said, finally dismounting and taking a step toward the porch. Yes, you are, Jacob replied, and something in his voice made all four men go very still. You're going to get back on your horses, ride out of my valley, and never come back. And if any of you ever bother, Mrs. McKenna again, if you so much as speak her name in town, I'll come down from these mountains and remind you why. People tell stories about men like me. The threat hung in the air between them, backed by 8 years of mountain living and whatever experiences had driven Jacob to seek solitude in the first place. Sarah could see the calculation in the stranger's eyes as they weighed their chances against a man who showed no fear and clearly had nothing left to lose. Psst! Caldwell remounted his horse with hands that shook slightly. This isn't over, Mrs. McKenna. You can't hide up here forever. She's not hiding, Jacob said. She's living free. Something you people wouldn't understand. As the four men rode away through the falling snow, Sarah found herself shaking, not from cold, but from anger and disgust at what they had tried to do. They had come to her refuge, to the place where she had finally found peace, and tried to drag her back into a nightmare of their own making. Sarah, Jacob said gently, his hand touching her shoulder. They're gone. She turned to face him, seeing the concern in his brown eyes and the lingering anger at what he had witnessed. They'll come back, won't they? Or send others. Maybe, Jacob admitted. But they won't find us if they do. What do you mean? Jacob looked out at the snow-covered valley, then back at Sarah. I know places up in the high country where nobody will find us. Places my father showed me that aren't on any map. If we need to disappear for a while, we can. Sarah nodded, grateful for his protection, but troubled by the implications. How long could they run? How long before the outside world caught up with them, no matter how well they hid? But as she looked at Jacob's determined face and felt the strength of his presence beside her, Sarah realized something important. She was no longer alone in facing whatever came next. For the first time since Thomas died, she had someone willing to stand with her against the world's cruelty. 2 days after the unwelcome visitors had departed, Sarah was organizing the root cellar when she heard the sound of a single horse approaching the cabin. Her heart hammered as she climbed the wooden steps, expecting to see the return of Mayor Caldwell or his hired men. Instead, she found a well-dressed woman dismounting from a fine bay mare, her expensive traveling clothes and confident bearing marking her as someone of considerable means. The woman was perhaps 45, with graying brown hair pinned in an elegant style and intelligent grey eyes that took in every detail of the mountain clearing. She moved with the assurance of someone accustomed to command, but there was nothing threatening in her demeanor. Mrs. McKenna, the woman called out as Sarah emerged from the root cellar. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I believe we need to speak. Jacob appeared from the barn, where he had been tending to his horse, his rifle held loosely but ready. Ma'am, he said with careful politeness, you're a long way from anywhere. Indeed I am. Mr. Stone, I've come specifically to speak with Mrs. McKenna about a matter of great importance. Margaret Whitmore's voice carried the cultured accent of Eastern education. May I come inside? What I have to say is rather shocking, and I think Mrs. McKenna will want to be sitting down when she hears it. Sarah exchanged glances with Jacob, both of them wary after their recent experience with unexpected visitors. But there was something different about this woman, an honesty in her bearing that the men from Cedar Ridge had lacked. Come in, Sarah said finally, but understand that Mr. Stone will be present for whatever you have to say. I would expect nothing less, Margaret replied with what appeared to be genuine approval. Inside the cabin, Margaret accepted the chair Sarah offered but declined coffee. She reached into her satchel and withdrew a leather portfolio. Setting it carefully on the table, "Mrs. McKenna," she began, "what I'm about to tell you will be difficult to hear, but you have a right to know the truth about your family and your circumstances." Sarah felt Jacob move closer, his presence a steady comfort as Margaret opened the portfolio and withdrew several official-looking documents. "My name is Margaret Whitmore, and I am an attorney representing the estate of Charles McKenna of Denver. Charles McKenna was your husband's uncle, his father's brother." Sarah frowned. "Thomas never mentioned an uncle. He said his family was all dead. That's because Charles and Thomas's father had a falling out many years ago over family business. They hadn't spoken in over 20 years. Margaret arranged the papers on the table. "Charles spent those years building a considerable fortune in mining operations, real estate, and banking investments throughout Colorado Territory. I still don't understand what this has to do with me," Sarah said, though her heart was beginning to race with a premonition she couldn't name. "Charles McKenna died 3 months ago," Margaret continued. "He never married, had no children, and his will contained a very specific provision. His entire estate, valued at approximately $200,000, was to be left to his nephew, Thomas McKenna, or to Thomas's widow, if Thomas had predeceased him." The words seemed to echo in the cabin's quiet interior. Sarah stared at Margaret Whitmore, certain she had misheard or misunderstood something fundamental. $200,000? Jacob said quietly. "At minimum," Margaret confirmed. "The estate includes mining claims, property in Denver and Colorado Springs, and substantial bank holdings. Mrs. McKenna, you are one of the wealthiest women in Colorado Territory." Sarah's legs suddenly felt weak, and she sank into her chair. "That's impossible. If Thomas had a wealthy uncle, why were we living so modestly? Why did he work in the mines?" "Because Thomas never knew about Charles's success," Margaret explained gently. "Charles had been searching for his nephew for years, but Thomas had taken his mother's maiden name when his parents died. Charles only located him a few weeks before the mine accident, too late to reconcile with his nephew, but not too late to learn about Thomas's marriage to you." Sarah's mind reeled. Thomas, working in dangerous mines for minimal wages, while his uncle amassed a fortune. The tragic irony of it was almost unbearable. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Jacob asked. "Why wait until now?" Margaret's expression grew troubled. "Because certain parties in Cedar Ridge became aware of the inheritance and took steps to prevent Mrs. McKenna from learning about it. I've been trying to locate her for months, only to be told repeatedly that she had left town and no one knew where she had gone." "They knew," Sarah whispered, the pieces of an ugly puzzle falling into place. "The town council, Mayor Caldwell, they knew about the inheritance all along." "I believe they did, yes. And I believe they were orchestrating a plan to marry you to someone they could control. Someone who would give them access to your fortune in exchange for their assistance in arranging the marriage." Jacob's jaw tightened with anger. "That's why they tried to force her to leave town? They wanted to control where she went, who she ended up with. And when she disappeared to the mountains with you," Margaret continued, "they became desperate. I suspect the men who visited you recently were part of an increasingly frantic attempt to retrieve her before. She could learn the truth." Sarah felt sick as she remembered Robert Caldwell's words about parties, interested in arranging a suitable marriage. They had been planning to sell her into marriage, then steal her inheritance through her husband's legal control over her property. "Mrs. McKenna," Margaret said gently, "I need you to understand something else. This inheritance comes with no conditions beyond your identity as Thomas's widow. The money is yours to do with as you choose. You owe nothing to anyone in Cedar Ridge or anywhere else." Sarah looked down at the legal documents spread across the table, papers that transformed her from an unwanted burden into one of the most eligible women in the territory. The irony was bitter and complete. "They called me the woman no one wanted," she said quietly. "But they wanted my money all along." "I'm afraid so," Margaret confirmed. The question now is what you intend to do with this information. Sarah stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered valley that had become her sanctuary. Just days ago, she'd been content with her simple life in Jacob's cabin, grateful for basic necessities and the chance to start over. Now she was facing responsibilities and choices she had never imagined. What would happen if I refused the inheritance? She asked. Margaret looked surprised. Refused it? Mrs. McKenna, this is a fortune that could provide for you and your family for generations. You could live anywhere you chose, do anything you wanted. But what if I don't want it? Jacob moved to stand beside her at the window. Sarah, he said quietly, you don't have to decide anything right now. But you shouldn't refuse something that's rightfully yours just because other people tried to steal it. Margaret nodded emphatically. Mr. Stone is absolutely correct. Whatever you ultimately choose to do with the inheritance, it belongs to you. Refusing it would only allow those who schemed against you to benefit from their deception. Sarah turned back to face them, her mind struggling to process the magnitude of what she had learned. She was wealthy beyond anything she had ever imagined, but the knowledge felt more like a burden than a blessing. If I accept the inheritance, she said slowly, what happens next? There are papers to sign, accounts to establish, properties to transfer, Margaret explained. Most of it can be handled through correspondence, but some will require your presence in Denver for legal proceedings. And how long before people know? Before the news spreads? Margaret's expression grew sympathetic. I'm afraid that's unavoidable. An inheritance of this size cannot be kept secret, especially given the parties who were already aware of it. Sarah sank back into her chair, overwhelmed by the implications. Her quiet mountain refuge would become impossible to maintain once word spread of her wealth. She would become a target for every fortune hunter and schemer in the territory. Mrs. McKenna, Margaret said gently, may I ask you something personal? Sarah nodded. Are you happy here? In this remote place, living this simple life? Sarah looked around the cabin that had become home, at Jacob, who stood ready to support whatever decision she made, at the life they had been building together, based on mutual respect and genuine caring. Yes, she said simply. Happier than I've been since Thomas died, Margaret smiled. Then that's something to consider carefully as you decide how to handle your new circumstances. Wealth can provide many things, but it cannot purchase what you found here. As the afternoon wore on, and Margaret prepared to depart for her long ride back to civilization, Sarah felt the weight of her changed circumstances settling around her like an uncomfortable garment. She was no longer the unwanted woman seeking refuge in the mountains. She was Sarah McKenna, heiress to a fortune, and that identity would bring its own challenges and dangers. But as she watched Jacob help Margaret secure her saddlebags for the journey ahead, Sarah realized something important. Her wealth might change how the world saw her, but it didn't change who she really was or what truly mattered to her. The question was whether she could hold on to that truth when the full weight of her inheritance came to bear. Jacob's hunting rifle gleamed in the firelight as he carefully cleaned and inspected every component, his movements methodical and practiced. 3 days had passed since Margaret Whitmore's revelation about Sarah's inheritance, and the weight of that knowledge hung between them like a storm cloud waiting to break. Sarah watched him work from her chair by the fire, noting the tension in his shoulders and the careful way he avoided meeting her eyes. They had spoken little since Margaret's departure, both of them struggling to process how fundamentally everything had changed. You're planning something, Sarah said finally, her voice cutting through the cabin's oppressive quiet. Jacob paused in his cleaning, the rifle's action half disassembled in his hands. I'm planning to keep you safe. From what? From everyone who's going to come looking for you once word spreads about your inheritance. Jacob's voice was flat, controlled, but Sarah could hear the underlying emotion he was trying to suppress. And there will be many of them. Sarah set down her mending and moved to the window, peering out at the snow-covered valley that had been their sanctuary. Maybe they won't find us here. They'll find us, Jacob said with grim certainty. Money like that, it draws people like blood draws wolves. And some of those people won't be as polite as Mayor Caldwell. Sarah turned back to face him, seeing the worry etched in the lines around his brown eyes. So what are you suggesting? That we run? Keep running until they give up? Jacob resumed cleaning his rifle, his movements sharp with suppressed anger. I'm suggesting that you accept reality. You're not the unwanted woman anymore, Sarah. You're one of the richest people in Colorado Territory, and that makes you a target for every desperado conman and fortune hunter from here to California. And you think I should just leave? Give up the life we've built here? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with all the things they had been avoiding saying. Jacob set down his rifle and finally looked at her directly. I think you should go to Denver. Claim your inheritance properly and use that money to build whatever kind of life you want. His voice was steady, but Sarah could see the pain in his eyes. You don't belong up here anymore. Sarah felt as if he had slapped her. Don't belong here. This is my home now, Jacob, our home. No, Jacob said quietly, standing and moving away from her. This was a temporary refuge for a woman who had nowhere else to go. But you're not that woman anymore. You have choices now, opportunities, a whole world open to you. What if I don't want the whole world? What if I want this? Sarah gestured around the cabin, frustration and hurt making her voice rise. What if I want you? The words hung between them, finally spoken aloud after weeks of careful dancing around their growing feelings. Jacob's expression went carefully blank, and Sarah knew with sinking certainty that he was about to break her heart. You think you want this? He said, his voice gentle but implacable. But you can't know for sure. A few months ago, you were a refined woman living in town. Now you're talking about giving up a fortune to live in a mountain cabin with a man who spent 8 years hiding from civilization. I'm not giving up anything, Sarah said desperately. I'm choosing what matters to me. What matters to you right now, Jacob corrected. But what about next year? What about when the novelty of mountain life wears off and you start thinking about all the things you could have had? Sarah moved closer to him, searching his face for any sign that he wanted her to stay. Is that what you really think of me? That I'm so shallow, so fickle, that I'd trade away everything good in my life for money? Jacob's mask slipped for a moment, and Sarah saw the raw pain beneath his careful control. I think you're a remarkable woman who deserves better than a life of isolation with a broken-down soldier who's forgotten how to live among civilized people. You're not broken down, Sarah said fiercely. You're the strongest, most honorable man I've ever known. And if you think I'm going to let my inheritance drive me away from the first real happiness I've found since Thomas died, then you don't know me at all. Jacob turned away from her, staring into the fire. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe we don't really know each other. Maybe we've both been so grateful for companionship that we've mistaken it for something deeper. The words cut Sarah more deeply than any physical blow could have. You don't mean that, don't I? Jacob faced her again, his expression hard. Think about it, Sarah. A few months ago, you were desperate enough to follow a stranger into the wilderness rather than face whatever the town had planned for you. Now you're rich enough to go anywhere, do anything, marry anyone you choose. Are you really going to tell me that those circumstances don't change how you see your options? Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. The only thing that's changed is that you're looking for excuses to push me away. I'm trying to do what's best for you. No, you're trying to do what's safest for you, Sarah shot back. You're so afraid of being hurt again, so convinced that you don't deserve happiness, that you'd rather drive away the best thing that's happened to either of us. Jacob's jaw tightened. Maybe you're right. Maybe I am afraid. But that doesn't change the facts. You have a fortune waiting for you, and responsibilities that come with it. You can't just ignore that. Sarah sank into her chair, suddenly exhausted by the circular nature of their argument. I never said I would ignore it, but I also won't let it dictate my entire life. Then what do you propose? Jacob asked. How do you plan to handle an inheritance that size while living in isolation on a mountain? Sarah looked at him across the firelit cabin, seeing the man who had given her refuge when no one else would. who had taught her to survive and thrive in conditions she had never imagined facing. The man she had fallen in love with, despite all the reasons why it seemed impossible. "I propose we go to Denver together," she said quietly. "I'll handle the legal requirements, establish proper management for the inheritance, and then we come back here." Jacob shook his head. "It's not that simple, Sarah. An inheritance like that comes with social obligations, family expectations, business requirements. You can't just manage it from a distance and forget about it." "Watch me," Sarah said with quiet determination. "I didn't ask for this money, Jacob. I didn't seek it out or scheme for it. It came to me through tragedy and family dysfunction, and I'll be damned if I let it ruin the first real happiness I've found in years. And what about all the good that money could do? The people it could help, the problems it could solve?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. "You're right," she said finally. "The money could do a lot of good, but it can do that good whether I'm living in a Denver mansion or a mountain cabin. What it can't do is make me happy if I'm living the wrong life with the wrong people." Jacob sat down across from her, his rifle cleaning forgotten. "Sarah, I want you to listen to me carefully. In a few days, maybe a week, this valley is going to be swarming with people. Lawyers, fortune hunters, relatives you've never heard of, men claiming to be your true love, all of them wanting a piece of what you've inherited. Then we'll face them together." "No," Jacob said firmly. "We won't, because I'm going to take you to Denver myself. Make sure you're safely in the hands of people who can protect your interests. And then I'm coming back here alone." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. "You're leaving me. I'm making sure you're safe and free to make real choices about your future. Choices that aren't influenced by gratitude or circumstances or the isolation of mountain life. What if I choose you? What if I handle all the legal requirements and still choose to come back here, to this life, to you?" Jacob's expression softened for a moment, and Sarah caught a glimpse of the longing he was trying so hard to hide. "Then you'll know where to find me. Promise me," Sarah said urgently. "Promise me you'll still be here." Jacob was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire as if it might provide answers to questions he didn't want to ask. "I promise I'll be here if you truly choose to come back," he said finally. "But Sarah, I also promise that I won't make that choice easy for you. I won't write letters or send messages or do anything that might influence your decision. If you come back, it has to be because it's what you really want, not because you feel obligated or guilty or sorry for me." Sarah nodded, understanding the logic of his position even as it broke her heart. "And what if I don't come back? What if I decide that city life and social obligations are what I really want?" Jacob's smile was sad but genuine. "Then I'll be happy knowing you found where you belong." As they sat in the firelit cabin, both of them lost in thought about an uncertain future, Sarah realized that their conversation had fundamentally changed everything between them. Tomorrow, they would begin the journey to Denver and the confrontation with her inheritance. But tonight was their last night in the sanctuary they had built together, and both of them knew it might be their last night together. Period. Outside, snow continued to fall in the mountain darkness, covering their valley with pristine white that would soon be marked by the tracks of strangers. Change was coming whether they welcomed it or not, and all they could do was face it with as much grace and courage as they could manage. "Sarah," Jacob said quietly as they prepared to bank the fire for the night. "Yes? Whatever happens in Denver, whatever you decide about your future, I want you to know that these months with you have been the best of my life." Sarah felt tears finally spill over as she looked at the man who had given her so much more than shelter from a storm. He had given her back her sense of worth, her confidence in her own strength, and something she had thought she might never feel again, love that was freely given and deeply rooted. "Mine too," she whispered, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The emerald green dress rustled softly as Sarah descended the grand staircase of Denver's Whitmore Hotel, her hand trailing along the polished banister as she made her way toward the opulent lobby below. The gown had been delivered that morning, along with matching gloves, shoes, and jewelry, all courtesy of her newfound fortune and Margaret Whitmore's insistence that she dress appropriately for the evening's social gathering. Sarah paused halfway down the stairs, catching sight of herself in the ornate mirror that dominated the hotel's entrance hall. The woman looking back at her was elegant, refined and wealthy, everything the people of Cedar Ridge had claimed she would never be. The irony was not lost on her. It had been 2 weeks since she and Jacob had arrived in Denver. 2 weeks of legal meetings, document signings, and introductions to the various business interests that now fell under her control. Jacob had stayed just long enough to ensure she was safely established with Margaret Whitmore's law firm, then had quietly departed for the mountains without fanfare or extended goodbyes. Sarah touched the pearl necklace at her throat, another gift from her inheritance, and thought about the simple life she had left behind. Tonight, she would be formally introduced to Denver society as one of its newest and wealthiest members. Tomorrow, she would have to decide whether to embrace this new identity or find her way back to the mountain valley where her heart remained. "Mrs. McKenna," Margaret Whitmore's voice called from the lobby below. "You look absolutely magnificent." Sarah completed her descent, accepting Margaret's approving smile with mixed emotions. In the 2 weeks since their first meeting, Margaret had become both advisor and friend, helping Sarah navigate the complex world of her inheritance with patience and wisdom. "I feel like I'm wearing a costume," Sarah admitted, smoothing the silk fabric of her skirt in many ways. "You are," Margaret replied with surprising honesty. "Society expects certain things from a woman of your position. Tonight is about showing them that you can meet those expectations while maintaining your own sense of self." As they entered the hotel's main ballroom, Sarah was struck by the scene before her. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over dozens of elegantly dressed guests, their conversations creating a gentle hum that spoke of wealth, power, and social significance. She recognized several faces from newspaper photographs, prominent businessmen, political figures, and society wives who wielded considerable influence in Colorado territory. "Mrs. Sarah McKenna," the hotel's maitre d' announced as they entered, his voice carrying across the ballroom and drawing the attention of nearby guests. Sarah felt dozens of eyes turn toward her, appraising and curious. She lifted her chin and smiled graciously, drawing on the poise she had learned from her mother and the confidence she had gained through months of mountain living. Mrs. McKenna, a distinguished gentleman, approached them, his silver hair and expensive suit marking him as someone of importance. "I'm Senator Harrison Blackwood. I've been eager to meet the newest member of Denver's business community." Sarah accepted his offered handshake, noting the calculating look in his eyes. "Senator Blackwood, the pleasure is mine. I understand you've inherited Charles McKenna's considerable holdings," Senator Blackwood continued, his voice carrying the smooth authority of a practiced politician. "Quite a responsibility for someone so young." "I'm learning to manage it appropriately," Sarah replied carefully, aware that every word would be analyzed and reported throughout Denver's social circles. As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself moving through a series of similar conversations, polite introductions that carried underlying currents of curiosity, assessment, and sometimes barely concealed avarice. Men inquired about her business plans with the intensity of suitors, while women evaluated her dress, jewelry, and social graces with critical eyes. "You're handling this remarkably well," Margaret murmured during a brief lull between introductions. "I'm pretending I'm still on the mountain, dealing with wolves," Sarah replied quietly. "The techniques are surprisingly similar." Margaret's laugh was genuine and warm. "That's probably the most accurate assessment of Denver society I've ever heard." "Mrs. McKenna," another voice interrupted their conversation. Sarah turned to find a young man approaching with obvious nervousness, his dark hair carefully styled and his evening wear impeccable. "I'm Robert Harrison, Dr. Harrison's son from Cedar Ridge. We've met before." Though under different circumstances, Sarah felt her smile freeze as she recognized the man who had been part of the conspiracy to sell her into marriage. Mr. Harrison, what brings you to Denver? Business, Robert replied smoothly, though his eyes carried a calculating gleam that made Sarah's skin crawl. I wanted to apologize for the misunderstanding in Cedar Ridge. We had no idea about your true circumstances. Misunderstanding? Sarah's voice remained level, but she felt Margaret tense beside her. Is that what you call attempting to force me into marriage through fraud and deception? Robert's face flushed, but he maintained his polite facade. I think there were miscommunications on all sides. Perhaps we could discuss this privately? I believe we could reach an understanding that would be mutually beneficial. I'm quite satisfied with my current understanding, Mr. Harrison, Sarah replied coolly. And I have no interest in any arrangement you might propose. Mrs. McKenna, Robert pressed, stepping closer and lowering his voice. You must realize that a woman of your position needs proper guidance. The business world can be treacherous for someone without experience. Margaret moved protectively closer to Sarah. Mrs. McKenna has excellent legal and financial counsel. Mr. Harrison, she hardly needs advice from someone who participated in a conspiracy to defraud her. Robert's mask slipped slightly, revealing the anger beneath his polite exterior. You can't stay hidden behind lawyers forever, Mrs. McKenna, and you can't stay hidden in the mountains either. Someone of your wealth has obligations to society. My obligations are my own to determine, Sarah said firmly. Now, if you'll excuse us. As Robert reluctantly withdrew, Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction. The woman who had once been intimidated by Cedar Ridge's social pressures was now capable of facing down men who had tried to exploit her vulnerability. Well handled, Margaret said quietly. But I suspect that won't be the last attempt to pressure you into some sort of arrangement. Sarah nodded, understanding that her wealth made her a target for schemes far more sophisticated than anything Cedar Ridge had attempted. As she continued to navigate the evening's social complexities, she found herself thinking increasingly of Jacob's warnings about the world that would come seeking her fortune. The evening reached its crescendo when Senator Blackwood called for the guests' attention, tapping his crystal champagne glass with a silver spoon until the ballroom fell silent. Ladies and gentlemen, the senator announced, his voice carrying easily across the room. Tonight, we have the pleasure of welcoming a remarkable young woman to Denver society. Mrs. Sarah McKenna has not only inherited one of Colorado Territory's great fortunes, but she represents the finest qualities of frontier resilience and determination. Polite applause filled the ballroom as Sarah felt the weight of dozens of stares. This was her formal introduction to the life her inheritance had made possible, a life of privilege, influence, and social responsibility that seemed as foreign to her as the mountain wilderness had once felt. Mrs. McKenna, Senator Blackwood continued, would you honor us with a few words about your plans for your inherited enterprises? Sarah stood slowly, her heart racing, as she realized that whatever she said next would define how Denver society viewed her and her intentions. She thought of Jacob, alone in their mountain cabin, and of the simple life they had built together based on mutual respect and honest affection. Thank you. Senator Blackwood, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom. I am indeed grateful for the inheritance my late husband's uncle has left me, and I take seriously the responsibilities that come with it. She paused, looking around the room at the faces watching her with such intense interest. However, I want to make something very clear to everyone present. My wealth will not define my choices, nor will it determine where I live or whom I associate with. I intend to use this inheritance to benefit others while living according to my own values and principles. A murmur ran through the crowd, and Sarah could see surprise and some disapproval on several faces. Wealthy women were expected to embrace their social obligations, not declare independence from them. I have learned, Sarah continued, thinking of the months she had spent discovering her own strength, that true worth has nothing to do with money or social position. It comes from integrity, kindness, and the courage to live authentically regardless of what others expect. The applause that followed was polite but uncertain. as if the guests weren't sure whether to admire her principles or worry about her eccentricity. Sarah didn't care. She had spoken her truth, and in doing so, had reminded herself of what truly mattered. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Sarah found herself standing by the ballroom's tall windows, looking out at the gaslit streets of Denver. Somewhere beyond those lights, beyond the noise and complexity of city life, lay the mountain valley where she had found peace. "Penny for your thoughts," Margaret said. Joining her at the window, "I was thinking about choices," Sarah replied. "About what it means to be truly free," Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "And what conclusion have you reached?" Sarah turned from the window, her decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. That freedom isn't about having unlimited options. It's about having the courage to choose what makes you genuinely happy, regardless of what others think you should want. "And what makes you genuinely happy, Sarah?" Sarah smiled, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. A hand-carved door, morning coffee by a stone fireplace, and a man who sees my strength instead of my vulnerability. Margaret's own smile was knowing and approving. "Then I believe you know what you need to do." The simple gold bands caught the morning light streaming through Margaret Whitmore's office windows as Sarah examined them with quiet satisfaction. She had chosen them herself from a modest jeweler's shop, preferring their understated elegance to the elaborate rings that her newfound wealth could easily afford. "Are you certain about this decision?" Margaret asked, though her tone carried approval rather than concern. "You could have any ring in Denver, any wedding that society could imagine." Sarah closed the small velvet box and tucked it into her traveling bag. "I'm certain. If Jacob and I are going to build a life together, it should reflect who we really are, not what others expect us to be." It had taken Sarah 3 weeks to arrange her affairs in Denver according to her own specifications rather than society's expectations. She had established a trust to manage her inheritance, appointed Margaret as her primary legal representative, and set up charitable foundations that would distribute much of her wealth to causes she believed in: schools for frontier children, support for mining families, and assistance for women in circumstances similar to her own former situation. The inheritance would continue to generate income. But Sarah had structured everything so that she could live modestly while ensuring the money did good work in the world. She would be comfortable but not ostentatious, independent but not isolated from those in need. "I've prepared the documents you requested," Margaret said, handing Sarah a leather portfolio. "Property deed for the mountain valley, legal protections for your privacy, and financial arrangements that will allow you to live quietly without interference." Sarah accepted the portfolio with gratitude. "And the other matter we discussed?" Margaret's smile was distinctly satisfied. "Mayor Caldwell and his associates will find their business prospects considerably diminished in the coming months. I've made sure that their attempts to defraud you have become common knowledge among territorial authorities and business leaders." "I don't want revenge," Sarah said carefully. "I just want to ensure they can't do to other women what they tried to do to me." "Justice and revenge are not the same thing," Margaret replied. "What I've arranged is justice." As Sarah prepared to leave Denver for what she hoped would be the last time in a long while, she reflected on the transformation she had undergone in the past month. She had arrived as a refugee from small-town prejudice and was departing as a woman who had faced down society's expectations and chosen her own path. The journey back to the mountains took 2 days, and with each mile that carried her away from Denver's noise and complexity, Sarah felt herself becoming more fully herself again. She had hired a guide for the trip, a weathered frontiersman named Tom Garrett, who asked no questions and respected her need for quiet contemplation. "Valley you're heading to is pretty remote," Tom commented as they made camp on their final night before reaching Jacob's cabin. "Most folks don't even know it exists." "That's exactly why I'm going there," Sarah replied. "Watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky must be something special waiting for you up there." Sarah thought of Jacob, probably sitting by his fire at that very moment, reading or working on some project, living the solitary life he had returned to after bringing her to Denver. She wondered if he believed she would come back, or if he had resigned himself to permanent solitude. "Yes," she said simply, "something very special." The next morning brought them to the edge of Jacob's Valley, and Sarah's heart began to race as familiar landmarks came into view. The cabin looked exactly as they had left it. Smoke rising from the chimney and Jacob's horse visible in the small corral behind the barn. "This is as far as I go," Tom said, helping her unload her minimal belongings. "You sure you want me to leave you here alone?" "I'm not alone," Sarah replied, looking toward the cabin where a tall figure had appeared in the doorway. Jacob stood motionless for a long moment, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. Then he began walking toward them with the steady, purposeful stride Sarah remembered so well. "Sarah," he said as he reached them, his voice carefully controlled. "You came back." "I told you I would," she replied, searching his face for any sign of his feelings. Jacob nodded to Tom Garrett, who tactfully busied himself securing his packhorse while the reunion played out. "How long can you stay?" Jacob asked. Sarah smiled and pulled the property deed from her bag. "As long as you'll have me. This valley is ours now, legally, officially, permanently." Jacob took the document with hands that shook slightly, scanning the official language that made their mountain sanctuary truly their home. "Sarah, you didn't have to—" "Yes, I did," she interrupted gently. "I had to make sure no one could ever force me to leave again." Tom Garrett cleared his throat diplomatically. "I'll be heading back now, Mrs. McKenna. You folks have a good life up here." As the guide departed, Sarah and Jacob stood facing each other in the clearing, where they had first learned to trust and care for one another. The weeks apart had changed nothing essential between them, but had confirmed what they both already knew, that what they had found together was worth more than any treasure. "I brought something else," Sarah said, pulling out the small velvet box containing the wedding rings. Jacob's eyes widened as he recognized what she was offering. "Sarah, I know you said I had to choose freely, without pressure or obligation," she said, opening the box to reveal the simple gold bands. "Well, I've had all the freedom in the world for the past month. I've been courted by influential men, pressured to accept social obligations, and offered every luxury that money can buy." She looked up at him, her heart in her eyes. "And all I wanted was to come home to you." Jacob reached out slowly, taking one of the rings from the box. "Are you asking me to marry you, Sarah McKenna?" "I'm asking you to build a life with me," she replied. "A real life based on love and respect and partnership. What do you say, Jacob Stone?" Jacob's answer was to slip the ring onto his finger, then take the other ring and gently slide it onto Sarah's hand. "I say yes to everything," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "To marriage, to partnership, to whatever life we can build together in this valley." As they held each other in the shadow of the mountains that had brought them together, Sarah knew she had finally found her true home, not in a place, but in the arms of a man who had seen her worth when the rest of the world had written her off. 6 months later, Sarah Stone stood in the doorway of their cabin, watching the spring sun paint the mountain peaks with gold and rose. The carved wooden sign beside the door read, "Stone Homestead," in letters that Jacob had carved and Sarah had painted in cheerful blue, a symbol of the partnership they had built together through a long, peaceful winter. The changes to their valley were subtle but significant. Sarah's inheritance had allowed them to make improvements that enhanced their simple life without compromising its essential character. A larger garden plot where they could grow more of their own food. A workshop where Jacob could pursue the woodworking that had become his passion. A small library where Sarah spent her evenings reading and where she had begun writing letters to other women in situations similar to her former circumstances. "Morning, wife," Jacob said, emerging from the barn where he had been tending to their animals. The word still carried a note of wonder when he spoke it, as if he couldn't quite believe their happiness was real. "Morning, husband," Sarah replied, enjoying the way the simple exchange grounded them both in the reality of their commitment to each other, their Wedding had been exactly what they had wanted. A simple ceremony, performed by a traveling preacher in their own cabin, with Tom Garrett and Margaret Whitmore as witnesses. No elaborate gown or society guests, just two people pledging their lives to each other in the place they had chosen to call home. "Letter came yesterday," Jacob said, holding up an envelope bearing Margaret's familiar handwriting. "Thought you might want to read the news from Denver." Sarah accepted the letter with curiosity. Margaret's correspondence kept them connected to the outside world without requiring them to be part of it, providing updates on legal matters and news about the charitable foundations Sarah had established. As she read, Sarah's eyebrows rose with surprise and then satisfaction. Margaret writes that the territorial governor has appointed a commission to investigate fraudulent marriage schemes targeting widows and single women. "Apparently, our experience in Cedar Ridge wasn't unique." "Good," Jacob said with grim satisfaction. "Maybe other women won't have to go through what you did." Sarah continued reading, then smiled with genuine pleasure. "And she says the first school funded by our education foundation opened last month in a mining town near Colorado Springs. 30 children who previously had no access to formal education. Your mother would be proud," Jacob said, watching Sarah's face light up with joy at the news. "Our mother," Sarah corrected gently. "This is our life, our work, our legacy." Jacob nodded, still sometimes surprised by how naturally Sarah included him in every aspect of her plans and dreams. The inheritance that could have divided them had instead become a tool for building something larger than either of them could have created alone. "Speaking of legacy," Sarah said, folding the letter carefully, "I have something to tell you." Something in her tone made Jacob look at her more closely, noting the particular glow in her cheeks and the way she unconsciously rested her hand on her stomach. "Sarah," he said quietly, hope and wonder beginning to dawn in his expression. "Dr. Morrison confirmed it when he came through last week," she said, her smile radiant. "We're going to have a child, Jacob, a little stone to grow up in our mountain valley." Jacob's response was to sweep her into his arms, spinning her around in the morning sunlight as his laughter echoed off the surrounding peaks. When he set her down, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "A child," he said wonderingly. "Our child. Are you happy?" Sarah asked, though his expression made the question unnecessary. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Jacob replied, his hands cradling her face with infinite gentleness. "Grateful, amazed, terrified, and happier than I thought any man had a right to be." As they stood together in the doorway of their home, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, she had been the woman no one wanted, driven from her community and facing an uncertain future alone. Now she was a cherished wife, expectant mother, and partner in a life that perfectly balanced solitude with love, simplicity with purpose. "Do you ever regret it?" Jacob asked, as if reading her thoughts. "Be giving up the life you could have had in Denver?" Sarah looked around their valley, at the garden they had planted together, the mountains that sheltered them, the cabin that had become a true home. "Never," she said with absolute certainty. "This is where I belong. This is who I was meant to be, even when the baby comes and life gets more complicated." Sarah laughed, imagining their quiet cabin filled with the sounds of children playing and learning. "Especially then. Our child will grow up knowing that worth isn't measured by what others think or what you own, but by how you treat people and whether you live according to your principles." Jacob nodded, understanding the legacy Sarah was speaking of. Not the financial inheritance that had changed her circumstances, but the values and strength they would pass on to their children. "And if our child wants something different, city life, society, things we can't provide up here, then we'll support those dreams too," Sarah said simply. "But we'll make sure they understand they always have a home in this valley, with parents who love them unconditionally." As the morning sun climbed higher, painting their valley with warm spring light, Sarah and Jacob began their daily routine of caring for their animals, tending their garden, and maintaining the home they had built together. But now every task carried additional meaning. Every plan included considerations for the child who would soon join their mountain family. That evening, as they sat by the fire that had witnessed so many important conversations, Sarah opened her mother's recipe book and began planning meals that would nourish both her and the baby growing within her. Jacob worked on carving a small wooden toy, the first of many gifts he would create for their child. "You know," Sarah said, looking up from her planning, "I think Mother would have loved this place, would have loved you and your father." Sarah smiled, thinking of the gentle man who had taught her to read and encouraged her curiosity about the world. He would have appreciated a man who values his daughter's mind as much as her heart. As they prepared for bed in the cabin, where they had first learned to trust each other, Sarah thought about the story she would someday tell their child, about how love could bloom in the most unexpected places, how true worth had nothing to do with what others thought, and how sometimes the person everyone else gives up on is exactly who needs someone to believe in them. Outside, the mountain wind whispered through the pine trees, carrying the promise of summer warmth and autumn harvests, of children's laughter and quiet contentment. In choosing love over expectation, simplicity over complexity, Sarah and Jacob had found not just happiness, but the profound peace that comes from living authentically in a world that too often demands compromise. They had built more than a homestead in their mountain valley. They had created a legacy of love, integrity, and the courage to choose what truly matters. And that legacy would endure long after the last snows melted from the highest peaks.